I'm a Baptist. I don't go to Mass.
Rico.
Well, how'd you get there before I came along?
How much did I try to improve?
Before becoming the first black man to win the Academy Award for Best Actor, before being hailed by Hollywood as a symbol of dignity and freedom, Sidney Poitier lived a life that even a movie script would have dared not to write. At the age of 16, he lied about his age to enlist in the U.S. Army during World War II, only to be thrown into a psychiatric hospital for veterans, a place where human beings were treated like living shadows. There was no glory, no heroic idealism, only fierce silence and a desperate gamble pretending to be insane in order to escape. That past was buried for decades, until the world knew Poitier only in a tuxedo holding an Oscar statuette. But what really happened during the months he wore a military uniform? How did a young man nearly crushed by war become someone who changed the history of American cinema? And what secret from Sidney Poitier's military past did Hollywood never want you to know, the premature child born at the edge of the world? Sidney Poitier did not enter life under stage lights. He entered it in circumstances so fragile that a single small deviation might have meant the world would never know his name. On February 20th, 1927 in Miami, Florida, a baby born 2 months premature let out his first cry during a rare trading trip by his parents, poor farmers from the Bahamas. No one in that room could have imagined that this frail infant would one day change the history of Hollywood. Yet from that very first moment, Sidney Poitier's fate had already begun to move along an extraordinary path. He was the youngest of 7 children. Poitier's parents were not Native Americans. They were merely in Miami by chance when he was born. Because of his premature birth, Poitier had to remain in the United States for the first 3 months of his life to receive medical care. This brief period, seemingly insignificant, unexpectedly granted him U.S. citizenship from birth. A small detail, but one that would later become the key to unlocking a journey across borders, across prejudice, and beyond the limits society placed on a poor black boy. Once his health stabilized, Poitier was taken back to the Bahamas. His childhood was not shaped by cities or modern schools, but by sand-sea winds and the barren fields of Cat Island, where his family lived until he was 10 years old. Life there seemed almost frozen in time. No electricity, no running water, no paved roads. Children grew up alongside labor sunlight and the harshness of nature. Sidney Poitier learned how to farm, how to survive, how to observe the world through the eyes of a poor but curious and quietly attentive child. He later recalled that his years on Cat Island taught him discipline, endurance, and a clear sense of the value of labor. But they also planted within him a vague longing, a sense that the world could not possibly be so small, that beyond the ocean, something greater must exist, something different, and perhaps more dangerous. When the family moved to Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas, Poitier's world began to move for the first time. At the age of 10, he saw an automobile for the first time in his life. He saw electric lights glowing in the night. He entered a movie theater and watched gigantic figures move across the screen. It was not merely entertainment. For Poitier, it was a shock of civilization. He did not fully understand what he was watching, but he felt the power of images of stories of people standing before a crowd and rendering it silent. Yet Nassau was no paradise. With a large family, limited means, and a bleak future, Poitier was a quiet, thin boy, with a heavy Bahamian accent and nearly illiterate as he entered adolescence. But it was within this quietness that he began to develop a deep inner life, something that would later become his greatest weapon on screen. In 1942, at just 15 years old, Sidney Poitier was sent to Miami to live with his older brother. His family believed that America would offer opportunity. What Poitier encountered instead was not opportunity, but his first collision with the brutal reality of Jim Crow racism. Florida in the early 1940s did not welcome a poor black teenager from the Bahamas. Whites only signs contemptuous stares and unspoken rules. No one explained all of it struck Poitier like a punch. He later said that this was the first time in his life he truly understood how profoundly different he was. Not because he was poor, but because of his skin color. Not because he was ignorant, but because society had already decided his place. Miami made Poitier realize that the American dream was not meant for everyone, at least not for people like him. Just 1 year later, upon turning 16, Poitier made a bold decision to leave Miami. He set out for New York City, alone without money, without connections, without a clear plan. But New York represented something Florida did not: the possibility of disappearing into the crowd and reinventing oneself. In that city, no one cared where you came from as long as you managed to survive. Sidney Poitier entered New York as an invisible man. He took the lowest jobs simply to stay alive. But deep within him, the fragments of his childhood, the endurance forged on Cat Island, the civilizational shock of Nassau, the bitterness of Miami, were quietly crystallizing. They had not yet created an actor, but they had created a man ready to face the harshest trials life was about to throw at him. And Poitier had no idea that soon he would put on a military uniform and step into a world even more brutal than racism war, where Sidney Poitier was nearly devoured by war. In 1943, as the United States was drawn into the brutal machinery of World War II, Sidney Poitier was only a 16-year-old boy, thin, penniless, carrying a heavy Bahamian accent and with virtually no place in American society. Yet instead of standing aside, Poitier chose to step directly into the storm. He lied about his age, turning himself into an adult on paper in order to enlist in the United States Army. This was not an act of heroism, nor a romantic gesture of patriotism. It was a desperate decision made by a young man who had nowhere else to go. For Poitier, war did not begin with trenches or gunfire. It began in the cold corridors of the Northport Veterans Hospital in New York, where he was assigned to serve. This was no ordinary hospital. Northport housed soldiers returning from the battlefield with shattered minds. Men who once carried rifles now screamed in delusion, withdrew into depression, or completely lost control of their behavior. For a young soldier who had never seen combat, it was a first shock of devastating force. Poitier was not trained to understand psychiatry. He was simply ordered to obey. Day after day, he witnessed veterans strapped to beds shouted at, subdued with crude violence. What haunted Poitier was not the madness of the patients, but the coldness of the system. These were men once called heroes. Yet upon returning, they became burdens, locked away, forgotten, treated like broken objects. For Poitier, this was the first time he clearly saw the true face of war. Not victory, not medals, but crushed souls. And more terrifying still was the realization that no one cared. The unrest within Poitier grew. He began to ask questions not aloud, but relentlessly. If this was the fate of those who survived war, then what was the price of becoming a hero? And what if one day he became one of them? The months at Northport did not train Poitier with weapons, but with observation. He learned to read people's eyes to distinguish fear, trauma, and despair through posture or breath alone. Later in life, Poitier would admit that this was his first acting school. A cruel one, but one that taught him how to understand human beings from the inside. But all endurance has its limits. Poitier gradually realized that if he stayed, he would be crushed either physically or mentally. At the age of 17, he faced an unthinkable choice: continue playing the obedient soldier or break the rules to save himself. He chose the more dangerous path. Sidney Poitier pretended to be mentally ill, not impulsively, not recklessly. He observed patients memorize their behaviors, learned how to perform instability convincingly without going too far. It was a performance of life and death, because if discovered, he could have been confined indefinitely or faced far more severe consequences. In the end, the plan succeeded. Poitier was deemed psychologically unfit to continue service and was discharged under Section 8 in December 1944. He left the military before turning 18 without medals, without glory, carrying only memories he would rarely speak of for many years. Yet this period carved into Poitier something no school could teach: inner discipline. He learned what invisible power was, what a callous system looked like, and how human beings could be forced to perform roles imposed by society. Ironically, the experience of pretending to be insane in order to survive became the foundation of his later acting career, where Poitier would use the very art of performance to reveal truth, not conceal it. When Poitier left the army, he did not return as a victor. He returned as a survivor. But from that depth, a clear realization took shape. If he was going to live, he would live with purpose. He would not let anyone define his worth. He would not allow systems to suffocate human dignity. And from here, Sidney Poitier entered the next chapter of his life. one in which he would use art to do what the military and war had failed to do: look directly at humanity and force the world to look with him. Sidney Poitier's journey to conquer Hollywood. When he left the military at the end of 1944, Sidney Poitier carried none of the glory of a soldier with him. He returned to New York empty-handed, burdened with heavy memories, and a very clear feeling if he continued drifting, he would disappear from this world forever. There was no way back. Either he would create a place for himself or be swallowed among the millions of nameless people in the largest city in America. The early post-war years were a struggle for survival. He worked as a waiter, a dishwasher, a laborer, anything that could earn him a few dollars to get through the day. Yet amid that harsh rhythm of life, memories of evenings in Nassau sitting in a movie theater watching people on the screen render an entire audience silent continued to haunt him. Poitier did not know exactly how he would become an actor. He only knew that this was the one path that could give his life meaning. He sought out the American Negro Theater ANT, a theatrical organization that gathered rare black artists who had any chance to create at a time when Broadway was nearly closed to them. Poitier's first audition was a disaster. He could not sing, his pronunciation was still heavily Bahamian, and his acting technique was almost non-existent. People laughed, they shook their heads. But unlike the boy who once fled Miami, Poitier did not walk away this time. He devoted the next 6 months entirely to practicing speech reading and standing in front of a mirror. Poitier learned every syllable, corrected every flaw in pronunciation, refined his voice until it was no longer an obstacle. This was the discipline the military had instilled in him, a discipline that required no supervision. Then, in 1946, opportunity arrived. Poitier was cast in the lead role of Lysistrata on the Broadway stage. The play did not run long, nor did it cause a sensation, but for Poitier, it was the first door to open. He was no longer on the margins. He was standing on the stage. From the stage, Poitier began to look toward cinema, where influence was greater, but barriers were even harsher. In the late 1940s, Hollywood still viewed black actors as decorative side roles or rigid stereotypes filled with prejudice. But in 1950, Poitier shattered that image with No Way Out. Playing a black doctor confronting racism head-on, Poitier did not merely perform, he challenged. The film was controversial, but impossible to ignore. For the first time, Hollywood was forced to pay attention to a black face that did not bow, did not play the fool, and did not apologize for its existence. In 1955, Blackboard Jungle lifted Poitier's name to a new level. The film was a major success, turning him into an A-list star, something nearly unthinkable for an African-American actor at the time. But the true turning point came in 1958 with The Defiant Ones. As a black prisoner chained to a white prisoner, Poitier forced audiences to confront painful questions about humanity and prejudice. The film received 8 Academy Award nominations, and Poitier became the first black actor nominated for Best Actor. American film history officially shifted course. The 1960s were the period when Sidney Poitier was not only famous, but became a symbol. In 1963, with Lilies of the Field, he won the Academy Award for Best Actor, becoming the first African American to achieve this honor. The Oscar was not merely a personal reward, but a direct blow to a system that had long claimed American audiences are not ready for a black star. In the years that followed, Poitier consistently chose roles with strong social weight. A Raisin in the Sun, A Patch of Blue Porgy, and Bess. Each film was a piece in building the image of a black man who was intelligent, humane, and resilient. Then in 1967, Poitier reached an undisputed peak. 3 films released in the same year: To Sir with Love Guess, Who's Coming to Dinner, and In the Heat of the Night, all achieved great success. All 3 confronted racial discrimination, and all 3 triumphed at the box office. At that point, Poitier was not just an actor, he was the voice of an era. He became one of the highest-paid stars in Hollywood, something once considered impossible. But Poitier did not stop at standing in front of the camera. In the early 1970s, he stepped into directing a risky move. With Buck and the Preacher, 1972, followed by A Warm December Uptown Saturday Night and Let's Do It Again, Poitier expanded creative boundaries, proving that black artists could not only perform, but also control their own narratives. From the late 1970s onward, Poitier gradually withdrew from the spotlight. He appeared occasionally in films such as Shoot to Kill and Sneakers, but the focus of his life had shifted. In 1997, he was appointed ambassador of the Bahamas to Japan and UNESCO, a role he held until 2007. From art, Poitier moved into diplomacy, continuing the fight for human rights, but in a different language. At the same time, he wrote memoirs, This Life, The Measure of a Man, Life Beyond Measure. With no fictional characters, Poitier told his own story, a man who once pretended to be insane to survive, who was rejected and doubted, yet never allowed the world to define his worth. Sidney Poitier's career journey is not merely a success story. It is the story of a man who emerged from war, from racism, from darkness, and forced the light itself to change shape. And for that reason, the legacy he left behind reaches far beyond cinema. The wealth of a man who never let money define him. When speaking of Sidney Poitier's wealth, the figure of 20 million USD is often cited as a milestone enough to place him among the most successful artists of the 20th century. But to view Poitier solely through the lens of money is to miss the most important point. He was one of the very few Hollywood stars who acquired power before acquiring wealth, and who always regarded money as a consequence, not a goal. The 1960s marked a turning point not only in Poitier's career, but also in his financial standing. In a Hollywood where black actors were routinely underpaid, Poitier broke that order. The New York Times once noted that at the height of his career, he was among the highest-paid actors in the film industry, ranking just behind names such as Richard Burton and Paul Newman. This was not merely personal success. It was a declaration. The value of an actor is not determined by skin color, but by the weight they carry at the box office and in popular culture. Films such as Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night, and To Sir with Love were not only artistic triumphs, but also major revenue engines. Poitier understood this clearly. He knew that every contract was not just money, it was leverage to negotiate, to refuse roles that insulted human dignity, and to maintain control over his public image. In an industry accustomed to distorting black representation, Poitier used his own economic value to force Hollywood to listen. When he moved into directing and producing in the early 1970s, Poitier continued to expand his financial influence. Films such as Uptown Saturday Night and Let's Do It Again achieved box office success, proving that black-led films could generate substantial profits. This not only brought income to Poitier, but also paved the way for future generations of African-American artists to enter roles that controlled the flow of money, something that had previously been almost an exclusive privilege of white Hollywood. Poitier's wealth did not exist solely in salary figures. He invested in real estate, most notably a residence in Beverly Hills, California, estimated to be worth between 7 and 10 million USD. The home was not merely a symbol of success, but a private fortress where Poitier withdrew from the noise of fame. He did not cultivate a stereotypical Hollywood image of extravagance. No supercars, no ostentatious parties, no displays of excess. For Poitier, wealth meant freedom of choice, not a tool for impression. Alongside material assets was symbolic capital, something money cannot buy. Poitier was one of the very few artists to possess nearly the full range of the most prestigious honors: an Oscar, Golden Globe, BAFTA, honorary Grammy Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Academy and the Screen Actors Guild, and numerous international honors. Each distinction not only elevated his personal stature, but reinforced his position as a moral and artistic standard. In 1974, Poitier was appointed an honorary knight by the British Crown, an exceptionally rare honor for a foreign artist. In 2009, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States. These honors did not bring direct financial gain, but they placed Poitier in a different class altogether, the class of individuals who shape history, rather than merely reflect it. What distinguished Sidney Poitier most was his view of wealth itself. In his memoirs, he openly acknowledged that money gave him security, something his impoverished childhood had never known. But he also warned of the trap of financial success. When money begins to dictate choices, the artist loses his soul. For that reason, Poitier repeatedly turned down lucrative roles that conflicted with his values, a rare decision especially for someone who had emerged from poverty. When he passed away, Sidney Poitier's estimated 20 million USD estate was distributed among his family, his wife, children, and loved ones. But the greatest financial legacy he left behind did not lie in bank accounts. It lay in the precedent he set that a black artist could be successful, wealthy, and still retain full dignity. That money does not have to be an instrument of compromise, it can be an instrument of freedom. For Sidney Poitier, wealth was never the destination. It was merely a sign that he had gone far enough that no one could deny his worth any longer. The rare scandals in the life of Sidney Poitier. Compared with most Hollywood stars of his era, Sidney Poitier's private life was largely free of major scandal. Nevertheless, there were two notable incidents that attracted public attention and are recorded in his official biographies. The most prominent scandal involved his personal relationships. From 1959 to 1968, Poitier had a romantic relationship lasting approximately 9 years with actress Diane Carroll at a time when both were married to other partners. This information was later confirmed in biographical accounts. The direct consequence was the end of Poitier's marriage to his wife Juanita Hardy in 1965, after 15 years together and 4 daughters. This is considered the largest and virtually the only personal scandal of his life, yet it did not significantly damage his film career. The second widely noted incident occurred in 1983, when a man named David Hampton impersonated Sidney Poitier's son to gain access to New York high society. Poitier never had a son, and the deception was quickly exposed. The story later became the inspiration for the celebrated play and film 6 Degrees of Separation. Poitier did not pursue legal action or public controversy, maintaining silence and composure in response. Aside from these 2 cases, Sidney Poitier was not involved in political or legal scandals. He was known as a principled individual who repeatedly refused roles that demeaned black representation, regardless of their commercial appeal. This consistency allowed Poitier to preserve a level of personal credibility and moral stature that remains rare in the history of Hollywood. The quiet foundation behind Sidney Poitier. If Sidney Poitier's career is recorded through films, awards, and historic milestones, then his family life existed in almost complete privacy. Poitier never turned his family into part of his public image. To him, it was a safe zone, free from camera flashes, judgment, and roles burdened with social expectations. Sidney Poitier married twice. His first marriage to Juanita Hardy began in 1950, when he was still struggling to establish himself in New York. The marriage lasted 15 years and resulted in 4 daughters, Beverly, Pamela, Sherry, and Gina. This period saw Poitier building his career, while also being a father under financially uncertain conditions. Although the marriage ended in 1965, Poitier maintained a strong sense of responsibility toward his children, ensuring that his private life did not interfere with his role as a father. In 1976, Poitier married for the second time to Canadian actress Joanna Shimkus. This marriage lasted more than 4 decades until Poitier's death and is considered the most stable and enduring relationship of his life. With Joanna, Poitier had 2 more daughters, Annika and Sydney Tamia. Unlike the high-profile image typical of Hollywood families, the Poitier chose a quiet life, limiting media appearances and rarely sharing personal details publicly. In total, Sidney Poitier was the father of 6 daughters, a detail often cited as evidence of the central role family played in his personal life. Despite a demanding work schedule spanning many decades, Poitier consistently emphasized that family was the emotional anchor that helped him maintain balance amid the pressures of fame. In his later years, Poitier was also a grandfather to 8 grandchildren and a great-grandfather to 3 great-grandchildren. In his memoirs and rare public reflections, he frequently referred to his descendants as the most meaningful continuation of his life, surpassing any award or title. For Poitier, family legacy was no less important than artistic legacy. Poitier's bond with his homeland, the Bahamas, was also evident in real-life events. In 2019, when Hurricane Dorian devastated the Bahamas, as many as 23 of his relatives were briefly reported missing. The incident caused deep concern for Poitier and his family, before it was later confirmed that all had been rescued. This detail illustrates that although Poitier spent much of his life in the United States and Europe, he never severed his connection to his roots. Behind the global icon stood a man who reserved absolute privacy for his family. Without display, without constructing a model family image for the public, Sidney Poitier chose to shield his loved ones from the spotlight, just as he had protected himself throughout his life. Sidney Poitier's legacy. When Sidney Poitier passed away in 2022, the world was not merely bidding farewell to a great actor. It was saying goodbye to a milestone in American cultural history. For Poitier was not simply someone who succeeded in Hollywood, he was someone who altered the structure of Hollywood itself, reshaped how society viewed Black people, and more profoundly redefined standards of human dignity in the public sphere. In the history of American cinema, few figures stand simultaneously as artistic icons and social symbols, the way Sidney Poitier does. USA Today called him a true icon without the need for qualifiers. Vanity Fair went further, likening Poitier to the Martin Luther King Jr. of cinema, not because he stood behind a podium, but because he compelled millions of viewers to see the world differently through images on a screen. The New York Times stated it succinctly and accurately. Sidney Poitier was the man who opened the door for Black actors, in an industry originally built to exclude them. Before Poitier, African-American actors were rarely given central roles, and even more rarely portrayed as fully realized human beings, intellectual, moral, conflicted, and emotionally complex. After Poitier, that became possible. Not immediately, but the door had been opened, and it could not be closed again. Later generations, from Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman to countless other Black artists, walked a path that Poitier was the first to carve at great personal cost. What makes Poitier's legacy enduring is not the number of films he made or the awards he won. It lies in the standard he set. Poitier established a moral benchmark for the representation of Black people on screen. No self-degradation, no caricature, no apology for existing. He repeatedly turned down highly paid roles simply because they reinforced stereotypes or wounded the dignity of his community. In an industry willing to compromise for profit, such resolve was revolutionary. Sidney Poitier's spiritual legacy therefore extends far beyond cinema. In memoirs such as The Measure of a Man and Life Beyond Measure, he spoke little about fame. He spoke about choice, about how true power lies not in recognition, but in the ability to say no. About how success is meaningless if it costs you yourself, and about how dignity is not something society grants. It is something you must defend, even at a price. After Poitier's death, Broadway dimmed its lights in his honor. Movie theaters across the United States screened retrospectives of his most important works. Countless articles, documentaries, and film curricula revisited the journey of a premature child raised in poverty in the Bahamas, who once pretended to be insane to escape the military, and who later stood on the Oscar stage and forced the world to change its perspective. Yet perhaps Sidney Poitier's greatest legacy does not reside in any monument or ceremony. It lives in what now seems ordinary when a Black actor is cast in a leading role without question, when a Black character is written as complex and human rather than symbolic, when audiences no longer find such presence unusual. These things were once unimaginable until Sidney Poitier appeared. His life has ended, but the story has not. Because Sidney Poitier left behind more than films. He left a precedent. And once such a precedent exists, history cannot turn back.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.